1914 in a little mining town called Barnesboro, Pennsylvania. Barnesboro is spelled B-A-R-N-E-S-B-O-R-O, Barnesboro. The town that is closest to it that may be familiar to some people who have recollections of the Johnstown flood, either by having read about it or seen pictures of it. The closest town of any size to Barnesboro, Pennsylvania is Johnstown, so you get an idea of the geography. Barnesboro is a city of about, city is an exaggeration. It is a village of about 400 people, and surprisingly enough, I know two prominent people who were born there. One is Duffy Doherty, the former great coach at Michigan's football coach at Michigan State University, was born in Barnesboro, and Charlie Oberberger, the polymer chemist and dean at the University of Michigan, was born in Barnesboro, Pennsylvania. Well, I didn't stay there very long. I was the fourth of four children that our parents had, and shortly after I was born, we found our way into Youngstown, Ohio, where my father was a milkman, had a milk route with two horses, delivered milk, and we children were always vying for the privilege of waking up at 4 o'clock in the morning, seeing if we can accompany our father. Well, unfortunately, my mother died when I was 5 years old, and my father tried for a while to keep the children together, but found it impossible, and so he arranged to put us in an orphanage called the Jewish Orphan Home in Cleveland, Ohio, and that was in October of 1920. All four of us went to that orphanage. That orphanage had about 450 children, about 200 of whom were boys, and the rest obviously girls. And I was raised in that orphanage. I was there from when I was 6 to 16. And the age in which we were released was 16, because that was the age you can get a working permit. Fortunately, I was able to finish high school by that time. I graduated from high school when I was 15, so that I had finished my high school by the time I left that orphanage. I worked for a couple of years. I left the orphanage in 1930, and I worked for 2 years in Cleveland. Practically all that time I was working in a pawn shop, and picked that business up fairly quickly, and at 17 I was the manager of a fairly large pawn shop in Cleveland, but of course that wasn't my intended career. And in 1932 I was awarded a small scholarship by Fred Lazarus Jr., department store chain magnate, who also at that time was chairman of the board of the Jewish Orphan Home, and he occasionally gave some funds for scholarship prizes to children from the orphanage, and I was fortunate to get one of those, and so started my career, academic career at Ohio State University in the fall of 1932. At Ohio State, I majored in chemistry. I didn't know very much about chemistry. Matter of fact, I never took chemistry in high school. But when I started to think of a career and try to do some exploring on my own, it seemed to me vaguely that somehow or other that was a field that would be of considerable interest, not because of my experience in it, but because of my general knowledge of what I thought chemists did and the kind of skills and abilities that might be required in order to be a successful chemist. I did take chemistry in night school just for a short time while I was working, just to see whether I had any bend for chemistry, and found that I did like what I took, but it wasn't any regular course. It was just a short exposure. So in 1932, I started chemistry at Ohio State University and went there for the full 4 years and got my undergraduate degree in 1936 and had quite a good record in chemistry. I was elected to Phi Beta Kappa, got my degree with high distinction in chemistry. And then there was a question of what I would do after graduation. Well, then as now, the route to a successful career meant getting an advanced degree. And so I, as was the custom in those days, and probably still is now, wrote to all the Big Ten schools and a few others applying for graduate teaching assistantship. And somewhat to my disappointment, having graduated first in a big class at Ohio State and the requisite honors, and never having gotten anything but an A in chemistry, I thought I would be a good candidate for a graduate student teaching assistantship. But I didn't get a single offer, and it was clear to me immediately that the anti-Semitic feeling among university professors and the chemical profession as a whole, including the corporations that hire people, was such that they would not encourage anybody who was Jewish to go on in graduate work. And so there I was, kind of stuck for graduate education and not having any prospects of continuing in school because of lack of financial support. Well, I went in and talked to the head of the chemistry department because I at Ohio State, because I had applied at Ohio State and had equal lack of success at Ohio State, where I thought they knew me and might respond favorably. But I was told outright that chemistry departments were not encouraging Jewish students to continue their graduate work because, as my department head said, it's in your own best interest, since you wouldn't be able to find a job even if you got your graduate degree. Well, I said that ought to be my problem, if not his. But he said that if I wanted to continue in graduate school, he would try to arrange a scholarship for me, which didn't involve any contact with students. That way I wouldn't contaminate students, and I would be able to continue with my studies. I agreed to that, and I got what was called the Ohio State University Scholarship. That's Ohio State University Scholar, which was actually a more prestigious position than the teaching assistant. Well, that enabled me to continue my studies, and then the question came, who should I want to work with? Well, I had done an undergraduate problem with G. Bryant Bachman, who was at Ohio State then. He was an professor of organic chemistry. And in the undergraduate laboratory, where I apparently worked fairly rapidly and successfully, I was singled out for helping in his research laboratory. And I thought if I would continue graduate work, I might consider working with him. But that year, he decided to leave academe, and he left Ohio State University to go to Eastman Kodak Company. Eventually, he ended up at Purdue University and finished his teaching career at Purdue. But that left me without a prospective research advisor. And so when the fall came around, I learned that a new professor of chemistry, or instructor, I think actually at that time, was coming to Ohio State to take Bachman's place. Now, the organic faculty there at the time, I had had most of the people who were on the faculty for coursework, undergraduate, and I frankly didn't care to work for any of the people who were there on the faculty at the time. So I decided that whoever this person was, I would work for the incoming person independent of what his particular area in organic chemistry was or who he was. Well, it turned out that that was Mel Newman, who came from postdoctoral fellowship at Harvard working at Pfizer, and he reported in 1937 to Columbus and started to get his office in shape in the chemistry building. Well, the day after he arrived, I walked into his office and introduced myself, Dr. Newman, and I said, I'd like to do my graduate work with you. Well, in those days, it wasn't often that an incoming instructor got graduate students very readily, and I don't know whether he was surprised or not, but he certainly was agreeable, and we had a little conversation about the area of work he was doing, and then he asked me when I would like to start. And I said, well, what's the matter with today? So he says, well, that's fine. He says, why don't you get started? So I said, well, what do I do? He says, well, look at this laboratory that I inherited. Look at all those dirty dishes, glassware in the corner there. And I think maybe you can start by cleaning up the lab and cleaning up that glassware. So he had one office laboratory that was assigned to him, and so we agreed that I would take one side of the lab and he would take the other side of the lab, and we started a collaboration that has almost lasted a lifetime. Well, it was a nice experience working with Mel Newman, because I was working right in the same lab, and so that I could see exactly what he was doing and how he did it. He had had a lot of postdoctoral experience at Yale and Harvard, and a very outstanding group of young aspiring chemists. So he was full of the techniques that were at the high-tech side of practicing organic chemists, and I considered myself unusually fortunate in being able to work in his lab. Well, the first year went by, and I got a master's degree during that first year of graduate study, and then the question came up what I would do the following year. And I told Dr. Newman that I felt that I really ought to have a teaching assistantship, and I wanted teaching experience. And he made inquiries and found that the head of the department wasn't yet willing to put me on as a teaching assistant. And so I decided I would leave school, and that I was really disappointed and not very hopeful about continuing prospects. So I left school in June after I got my master's degree of 1937 and went back to Cleveland, rented a room, and spent the entire summer looking for a paying position and walking the streets, and every company that had the word chemical in it was visited by me, but with no success. And so I eventually decided that what I better do is just keep my hands in chemistry, even if it meant not making much money. So I went to the Cleveland Clinic in Cleveland, Ohio, which was then fairly well established and fairly well known. And I talked to people doing some chemistry work and offered my services free of charge, which were accepted, except that they agreed to pay for my car fare and insurance. And I decided then that I would have to go back to school. I'd rather be unemployed at university than unemployed as far as salary went elsewhere. So when the fall came of 1937, I went back to Ohio State University and told Mel that I was willing to eat crow, that if I could get that scholarship back, which I had turned down, I'd be glad to take it again. Well, he must have pulled some strings at that late time, and then did in fact get me the scholarship back again. And so we started my PhD work in 1937, and that involved a continuation of what I had started as a master's program, which was a synthesis of some 1,2 benzanthracenes with substituents in various positions, which Mel had figured were important positions of substitution for carcinogenic activity, both in terms of the type of substituent and its position on this tetracyclic ring system. So my PhD thesis was concerned mostly with the synthesis of these polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. And the following year, after the first year of graduate work, which would have been my completion of the 2 years of graduate work, I applied again for a teaching assistantship, and this time I was told that since the work had been satisfactory, that I could be promoted to something called a Ohio State University Fellow, which was supposed to be even more prestigious than Ohio State University Scholar, but that I still couldn't get a teaching assistantship. So I settled for that, having learned my lesson, and in my last 2 years there, I was an Ohio State University Fellow. I completed my work with Mel in 1939, which, as you know, is still a big Depression year. Jobs were very scarce, and I had an opportunity, I thought, to continue doing some postdoctoral work at Harvard University with Arthur Michael. Arthur Michael, most organic chemists, if they know his name, they know his name through the Michael reaction, but don't associate that with the man who was, in fact, at that time, almost close to 80 years old, and hired people, a postdoctoral person a year, to work with him on funds that he supplied. And I learned about this position through a friend of mine who had gotten his degree with Mel Newman. I was Mel's first student, but this other fellow was Lloyd Joshua, came in with a master's degree, and he actually was the first person to be granted a PhD working with Mel. So I was Mel's first student and his second PhD student. Well, Joshua told me he was working with Fieser as a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard, and told me about the possibility of working with Michael, and I started a correspondence with Michael, and we were on our way to making a settlement, but unfortunately for me, Arthur Michael died. So that opportunity was cut off, and then the question was, where could I get a job? Fortunately, at that time, civil service positions were determined by written examinations, even PhD level. So I took a written examination for a U.S. civil service job, and was eventually hired by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration in Cincinnati, Ohio. So in 1939, I started my paid career as a chemist with the Food and Drug Administration in Cincinnati, Ohio. In 1940, it was clear that the war was imminent. That is, the war had started. Actually, the invasion by Germany of Poland occurred on the day I got my degree, on September 1st, 1939. And it was clear that the war was coming on. And I was thinking in terms of a career and what might happen if the United States did get involved. Well, about that time, I met the woman who was to become my wife, who was a social worker. Ruth Wildner was her name. And she was getting her master's degree from Smith College in social work. And as part of her master's degree requirements, she had to do field work, actual field work at some agency that was approved by Smith College, and she was assigned to Cincinnati. And we met together when we both were visiting at the Jewish Community Center in Cincinnati. And we had a very short courtship, and decided very soon after we met that we wanted to get married. So we were married on my birthday in 1941, June 4th, 1941 we got married. Shortly thereafter, she had to return to school for the summer, and I remained in Cincinnati. She went back to Northampton at Smith College to finish up her academic requirements, and then returned in the fall. Well, by that time, I was getting a little disillusioned with my position at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, although I had one very interesting problem, and that was concerned with the drug sulfanilamide. Sulfanilamide had been discovered a few years earlier as a powerful antibacterial agent, and its use depended on, it was the toluene sulfonamide, and its use depended, its activity depended on the substitution for one of the necessary components in the metabolism of bacteria. So it had to be taken in quite large doses. And a manufacturer who put this on the market, interested in preparing it in form for children, dissolved it in diethylene glycol to use as a solvent, because the sulfonamides are quite insoluble. You need a very good solvent. And one of the solvents that they found successful was diethylene glycol. And it turned out that diethylene glycol was very toxic. And since large doses were required, there were immediately almost 70 deaths of children who were given this so-called elixir of sulfanilamide. And the problem of identifying what was in this elixir and then finding ways of estimating its concentration was a problem that I was assigned to work on. So that was quite interesting. And it turned out eventually, of course, that the company was prosecuted not for using a toxic material, but for mislabeling, since anything called an elixir has to be an ethanol solution of whatever it is, and this wasn't ethanol solution. It was an alcohol, but it was not ethanol. And so the company was convicted for mislabeling rather than for anything more severe. And that led actually to a revision of the U.S. Food and Drug Act, which occurred shortly thereafter.
Were you able to find out what it was that was formed?
You mean in the metabolism of the diet? I don't know. We have no ways of investigating that, and as a matter of fact, I don't think it is known today why it's toxic. I'm not sure people understand why many things that are toxic are indeed toxic.
Who was chairman of Ohio State when you were there in 36?
William Lloyd Evans, known to we students as Billy Evans. And Billy Evans was a very puritanical person. I thought he set high standards for the students. One of the things about that period was that the Prohibition Act had been repealed, And if you wanted to buy alcohol, you had to go to a state licensed liquor store and sign your name with a request for whatever it was you wanted to purchase, but it required your signature. And it was common practice among the 170 or so graduate students at Ohio State that every time they went to purchase any liquor, they would sign their name, William Lloyd Evans, because he was a very strong proponent of abstinence. So I don't know what the Liquor Control Board thought about his consumption of alcohol, but he represented that austere, demanding kind of personality that I think he was well known for among the students in any case.
And how would you describe Melvin Newman at that time?
Well, Mel was very interested in lab work. He was very, very good in the laboratory. He taught me all the wonderful techniques that he had accumulated and knew and practiced. And he really, one of the most important things he taught me about lab work is that when it's necessary to do it well and carefully and take time, do it well and carefully and take the necessary time. But if what you're doing is not essential to the success of the thing, don't waste your time on it. So it's the utilization of time and the demand that things be done perfectly. Very, very high standards for laboratory performance.
And why was he interested in carcinogenic materials at that time?
Well, I think that was the problem that he got assigned by Fieser. Fieser at that time was carried on a big program on carcinogenic polycyclics. The recognition that they were present in the atmosphere was now accepted, and he had a big program with quite a few graduate students synthesizing a variety of polycyclics, trying to, of course, correlate structure activity. And in those days, the activity work was experiments with mice, and he had connections with the precursor to the National Institutes of Health, people who did the testing on mice and rats. And it was a very popular field, involved new kinds of synthesis, new kinds of characterization of polycyclic compounds, and a whole host of techniques for synthesis of these things. So I think that Mel and Fieser must have agreed about what kind of areas they would work in, so that his work wouldn't conflict with that of Fieser's. So Mel was very interested in synthetic procedures, performing them so that yields were very, very high. He insisted on you do a thing that you account, when you run a reaction, you account for 100% of your starting material, that you investigate all the side reactions, and see how much starting material you recovered. In other words, the mass balance business in organic chemistry was very important to him. And then purity was very important. Of course, our methods of determining purity then were rather primitive. Mostly it was by sharpness of melting point, believe it or not, on recrystallization and recrystallization until you reach the highest level, melting point level. And then there were the characterization of the hydrocarbons. That's when he became interested in complexes of polycyclic hydrocarbons, pi donor complexes with things like trinitrobenzene and picric acid, ways of characterizing hydrocarbons. So that was my PhD thesis, was concerned with the synthesis of some of these benzanthracines. Well, at the Food and Drug Administration, when I became restless there, I was transferred to the Chicago office. That required that my wife give up her job if she was going to move to Chicago, which she wanted to do. And so we moved to Chicago, and I had more of a disillusioning experience at Chicago with the Food and Drug Administration. I felt that they were using overqualified people. I could see their point of view because most of the things that had to be investigated, eventually, if they were proved effective, would turn into a court case, and then the testimony of the expert government witnesses had to be unimpeachable, and one of the ways of assuring that was to have highly qualified people doing the work. But as far as the work is concerned, it wasn't very challenging, and I thought I was more interested in doing challenging chemistry than service-oriented, analytical type chemistry. And so when my friend Lloyd Joshua, who had been working in Beltsville, Maryland, gave up his job and went to a office of, I think it was the Office of Price Controls, dealing with overseeing chemical manufacture and pricing. When his job opened up, he let me know, and I applied for and got a job with the Agricultural Department working at Beltsville, Maryland. Well, this required another move on our part, and this now was during the war, and we were working on the synthesis of compounds that might have been of interest in the treatment of shock. They were related to some animal sterols, and since it was still polycyclic work, but it was more saturated compounds and aromatic compounds, but it was still very fascinating. The person in charge of that unit was Louis Butts, and the work that I did was on Diels-Alder reaction using paraquinone and being able to put in an angular methyl group into rings AB in that system for introducing angular methyl groups. That was our major goal there. And the technique we used was mostly the Diels-Alder reaction. We spent quite a bit of time on that. Well, while I was there, the opportunity to join the U.S. Bureau of Mines came up, and I was interviewed for that position. And what was going to happen was that the U.S. government was going to undertake a program on converting coal to synthetic fuels, synthetic liquid fuels. For national security reasons, the feeling was that we should have secure sources of liquid petroleum, both for ourselves and our allies, and that in some of our commitments overseas, there weren't indigenous sources of petroleum, and the shipping would be quite difficult. But there were coal deposits in places like Alaska, for example. And the Congress passed a fuels bill, and in preparing for that research undertaking, there was a program on synthetic fuels from coal established at the Bureau of Mines in Pittsburgh. And I was asked to undertake the formation and operation of the organic chemistry part of that synthetic liquid fuels operation in Pittsburgh. So we changed our location again from Washington to Pittsburgh, and I started work at the Bureau of Mines on January 1st, 1943. And we gradually built up that unit from myself and one assistant to a group of about 25 people, doing the work on structure of coal, its reactions, ways to modify it, characterization of the liquid fuels that were made from coal in the Fischer-Tropsch reaction. And we had quite a large group working on these problems in the organic chemistry section. this was a very productive group of people in that whole operation. It was managed, the technical management was under the direction of Henry Storch, who was a wonderful person, a bright physical chemist, but a wonderful research director. And he really was able to generate the spirit of enthusiasm and commitment. And I think that the records will show that in that 10-year period, the Bureau of Mines at outside of Pittsburgh in a little suburb called Brewston was one of the most productive government agencies that ever functioned. Well, it takes us through the war years. And
Do you attribute that productivity to Storch's personality or his ability to attract good people, or a combination of both?
a combination of both. Henry Storch is up there, one of my heroes, second from the end there, on the left. And I think we all love him as a research director. He's a very fatherly figure. Managed to instill tremendous feeling, pride, effort, and commitment to the program.
How did he do this?
Well, in a gentle manner, but giving a lot of freedom to people, encouraging any kind of mode of expression. I think the principal guiding tenet was to try to get very able people and to let them go, interact with each other, plenty of opportunities for interaction, and the spirit of cooperation among units in the group, encouraging cross-fertilization of ideas, but mostly by example of being understanding, patient, supportive, all the things generous we associate with the good father. And I think it was that image. We're all approximately, the productive group, we're approximately in the same age group, in their late 20s to late 30s, in that period when there was a tremendous surge of interest and creativity. So there were a lot of very able people that he had gotten together. A substantial number of whom were Jewish, and I think it was also that factor, the fact that some of them were having hard times finding positions and couldn't find them in the government, which, so they were striving, able people who wanted to make contributions, ambitious, and there was a wonderful outlet for doing that in his organization.
Did you learn about Storch's qualities after you got there, or were you aware of them before you
No,
went?
after I got there. The person who interviewed me in Washington was a fellow by the name of Fieldner, A.C. Fieldner, who at that time was one of the greats in coal chemistry. Coal chemistry was quite primitive then, and there wasn't a hell of a lot known about the well, there isn't very much known now either about the structure of coal. Much more known today than then. But all the properties that led to certain kinds of coke. So there were a lot of practical problems and empirical wisdom that Fieldner had. And he was the one that interviewed me. And so I didn't meet Storch actually until I accepted the position in Pittsburgh. But that was a very nice period, and towards the 9th or 10th year being there, I had the feeling that I had to make a decision about whether I wanted to be sort of a middle management administrator of research or continue being a participant in research. I had a group there then of about 25, 26 people, and the bulk of those were technical people with degrees, 6 or 7 PhDs. So it meant spending a lot of time reviewing, encouraging, trying to emulate Storch on a lower level to try to maximize the creativity and research promise of people working with me. And I decided then that I really would like to try teaching.
What did you find most difficult and challenging about management as it was there?
Well, it was dealing with the effort it required to keep the organization lubricated. There were personality clashes, idea clashes, budgets to manage, people to massage, and although I thought I was moderately good at all that, I didn't find that as satisfying as the chemistry. Incidentally, before I took that bureau job at the Bureau of Mines, I had one other possible position that I had to decide between the Bureau of Mines position or this other position, which turned out to be a position with Fieser, with his group at Harvard. Fieser was very actively engaged in a variety of research problems, some of which dealt with development of uses for napalm. And the chemistry there was very interesting, and some of the devices that were being developed were very interesting. And Fieser offered me an opportunity to join his group at Harvard working on these war-related, espionage, intelligence kinds of things there. And I was really torn between joining his group, which meant that I would have been a member of a very bright, aggressive, accomplished, intellectually stimulating group, but just as a member of the group, or taking the responsibility for developing my own programs where I would have the considerable input into direction and administration. And I chose going to the Bureau of Mines and that challenge rather than going with the Fieser group. And I think that, of course, it's a moot question how the other would have turned out, but my experience at the Bureau was very rewarding, and I really liked that, and they gave me long-range interests that I've pursued ever since.
Who were some of the young people at that time that you interacted
My
with?
principal collaborators, there was Irv Wender, who was in the organic division, and a very creative person. Julian Feldman, who was in charge of my separations group. Heinz Sternberg, who's on the group of characterization and coal structure. Calvin Golumbik, who was very versed in some types of separation. Countercurrent extraction had just come in to vogue, and I thought that was a very useful concept. And Leslie Ragel was another collaborator. These are all the PhD level people. And a fellow by name Oscar Woolfolk, who was had a master's degree with Mel Newman, and was the first black scientist probably in the Bureau of Mines. He and I worked together. As a matter of fact, we have quite a few publications together. So we had 6 or 7 very able PhD people, and then groups of assistants, technicians who some of whom had bachelor's degrees and some of whom were just very clever technicians.
And how did you get into what is now organometallic chemistry?
Well, we had an interest, of course, in the Fischer-Tropsch reaction. Although our work in the organic division was not so much on mechanism, but on characterization. Towards the end of this period, Irv Winder was seeking out new areas that the organic division might work on, and he got me interested in trying to sell the idea of doing work on the oxo reaction, figuring that it was related to the Fischer-Tropsch reaction, but there was a hell of a lot more chemistry there, organic chemistry there. So Irv prepared an analysis of the status of the oxo reaction, and we talked a good deal about this, and actually then initiated a program on the oxo reaction, which he, under my supervision, was in charge of. And of course that is a transition metal catalyzed reaction, particularly cobalt was involved there. So he and I wrote a review paper delineating the status of the reaction and indicating where we might come in and fit in with that. And that was really the start of the homogeneous catalysis work that I subsequently became much more devoted to. Now when I got this position at the University of Cincinnati in 1953. And it was a kind of an unusual position at Cincinnati. It was in a department called the Department of Applied Science. And it was an unusual department in that it gave graduate degrees only in chemistry and in physics, and therefore was competitive with the traditional chemistry and physics departments on campus. However, the work there was entirely sponsored. All the work in the Applied Science Department was financed by external funds. And the people who were on the faculty were expected to generate the bulk of these funds. So it was kind of a risky business, because you knew that you had to go out and, in a sense, sell some of your research projects, and your salary depended on that. And at that time, I was a fairly high level in the civil service hierarchy, with an assured income and an assured future. And so I had to, of course, discuss this with my wife, who was very understanding of my ambitions, predilections, and we decided we would risk giving that up in Pittsburgh and try it in Cincinnati. And so my predecessor, who was Charles Frank, had been working on a project with the National Distillers that was coming to fruition. And he was offered a job with the company that he had started the research work with here at Cincinnati. And so he was leaving to become Assistant Director of Research or some such title at National Distillers. And this position that he occupied became open. And I accepted this position at the University of Cincinnati in 1953 as an Associate Professor of Applied Science. Well, that was really quite an interesting setup, and it was tricky to balance the basic interests of the academic side with the necessity for getting funded research. This may be a new problem to some people, it was no problem to me. And among other things, then I wanted to establish consulting arrangements with whomever I could. And one of the companies that I was anxious to establish a relationship with was the Houdry Company, because I knew they were a catalyst company. And so I became a consultant to the Hootry company, but I conditioned that consultantship with the requirement that they establish one of these fellowships at the University of Cincinnati, which would allow me to hire a student to continue the work and at the same time would provide me with extra income besides the supervising income associated with that. Well, I had to have 4 or 5 of these kinds of things to be operating simultaneously in order to maintain myself and my students. One of the problems which I inherited when I came to the Applied Science Department was a problem that was a collaborative effort with the Aeronautics Division of the Department of Navy, Bureau of Navy. And what they were interested in was in developing a coating for the leading edge of jet aircraft. Because, you may remember, the Korean War was the first war in which the United States participated in which jet aircraft were used to any extent. And it was discovered that if these jet aircraft flew through, at these very high speeds, through rainstorms, that there was considerable erosion of the leading edges of the aircraft. And the flying time was reduced enormously owing to this erosion of the leading edges from impact, degradation by rain droplets. And so the Applied Science Department had quite a project in which they would use panels of aluminum which simulated the leading edges, put them on a propeller and spin them in a simulated rainfall to determine the efficacy of a variety of coatings. And one of the problems were that whatever coatings were tried wouldn't adhere very well to the metal. Well, I inherited this problem, and we were looking then at standard kinds of hydrocarbon polymers, polystyrene, polybutadiene, mixed polymers, hydrocarbon polymers. And apparently they were having no luck on this, and then it occurred to me that we ought to try a completely different kind of polymer, which would have more polar groups on it to provide some interaction between the polar groups and the aluminum surface. And I decided on the polyurethane coatings, which were just coming into prominence and have been used in Germany. And they seemed to me to have some of the desirable qualities that we were looking for: high impact resistance, resistance to corrosion, and the possibility that they would adhere to metals very well. And then in order to have this appropriate for a PhD thesis, we had to work on problems that were related to the generation of these polyurethanes, but were basic chemistry. And the particular reaction which I chose was a cross-linking reaction, which I thought might be promoted by basic catalysts. The standard catalyst for polyurethane formation at that time was morpholine, which is a 6-membered ring having a nitrogen and an oxygen in the pair positions, and the other 4 atoms carbon. Morpholine was a fairly decent base and compatible with most solvent systems. But in looking at the cross-linking reaction, which we try to isolate, and determining the catalytic activity, we thought there was a great dependence on the steric factors and the basicity at the nitrogen center. So one of my students did a PhD thesis on the kinetics of the cross-linking reactions in polyurethanes and published a little paper on it. And it was really that background which led to the suggestion eventually of using DAPCO for polyurethane formation. Now the DAPCO story is really kind of an interesting little story. Among the other projects that I was working on at the Applied Science Laboratory, I was working with Emory Industries. And I had a student there, a most unusual student, who had been working at Emory Industries for 20 years as an engineer. His name was J.D. Fitzpatrick. He was a student who was older than I. And he wanted to get a PhD in chemistry. And so Emory had agreed to put him on leave with some fraction of his salary for enough time to get his PhD, but they wanted him to work on a problem that was related to their general areas of interest. So Fitzpatrick and I sat down and we worked out a very nice little problem together. He was a most unusual fellow, very fond of him. On the day he gave his master's thesis, he had a heart attack, had to be hospitalized for quite a few months. And he came back and started his PhD, and we were working on the isomerization of oleic acid to its trans-isomer, elatic acid, using selenium as a catalyst. Well, that's neither here nor there. But Fitzpatrick and I developed a very strong, warm friendship. And when he left to go back to Emory Industries, he asked me to be a consultant, or arranged for me to be a consultant to the company there, which I gladly agreed to because it allowed me to continue in my working relationship with him, and also as a source of additional income, which is not a bad incentive for me at that time anyway, with 3 kids to worry about. And during the course of one of my visits to Emory Industries, I passed the laboratory there and saw one of my night school students who was taking organic chemistry with me, working in the lab. I came in and say hello to him, asked him what he was doing, since I was sort of a consultant to the company. So he said that he was making some polyurethane foams, and he showed me what he was doing. He was foaming these in a cardboard milk carton, and looking at the time it took to expand, to take up all the volume of the milk carton, and then looking at the characteristics of the foam. So I asked him what the chemistry of this was, and it turned out that I knew all that chemistry because we had worked on this, not in foams. We hadn't been a foaming reaction. We had wanted to avoid bubbles, as a matter of fact. That was one of the big tricks in forming a good surface polyurethane, was it didn't have any bubbles, because that would obviously destroy the adhesion and be a site where you could impact these rain particles and start the deterioration. But so I had never worked on the foaming thing, but worked on the reactions leading to polyurethane. So I said, gee whiz, I think I got a good catalyst for you. Well, it had turned out that in my consulting work at Houdry, one of the chemists there they were working on some diethylene. They had working on ethylene diamine reaction, ethanolamine, ethylene diamine, and they had isolated a contaminant, which was a high melting solid, which was a nuisance to them. And one of the chemists had got interested in improving the structure of this. And in my consulting things, we discussed this, and finally the structure was worked out to be DADCO. And that was interesting, but of no particular practical significance to them. But when I saw this polyurethane foaming thing and found out what the catalyst was, which was actually it was N-methyl morpholine, I said, gee, I bet you this DADCO would work better than that, because it has no steric requirements. It's practically a sphere. All its carbon atoms are bent around, and the nitrogen lone pair is very exposed. As a matter of fact, from the ultraviolet spectra, we could tell that there was even interaction between the two nitrogens, and from the pKa1 and pKa2, we could see that there was a hell of a lot of interaction between the two nitrogens. As a matter of fact, although it was a tertiary amine, it wasn't that strong a base. So here we have something which was a moderately strong base with very low steric requirements. That just must be perfect for catalyzing cross-linking reactions where steric requirements are very severe. So I said, I'll get a sample for you next time I'm out here, and you try the DADCO instead of your N-methylmorpholine. And so next time I was out there, I brought along some DADCO, which I had gotten from Houdry, and asked him to substitute it for his N-methylmorpholine, but to put in 1/10 of the molar quantity that he had used in that. So this is a favor to me, he did that. And by golly, this thing just foamed right out of the carton at 1/10 the concentration, and we looked at the foam, got some of the original foam right up there, and it just looked beautiful. So naturally I wanted to get this information to Houdry. We can take that down off the wall. You like to take down off the wall?
No, I'll get it.
Huh?
I'll get it.
Well, Houdry wasn't in the organic chemistry business. Well, that was N-methylmorpholine. Now this sample down below here, this is my handwriting on the left there, in the panel, the lower panel, the handwriting panel. It says made with DADCO using 10% of the amount of N-methylmorpholine ordinarily used. Made in a beaker. If made in a machine, would be much more uniform. And you can see even now that that's a very nice uniform polyurethane. Well, I conveyed this information to Alex Mills, who was director of research at Houdry, and Alex Oblatt was a vice president. That was in 1956. And to make a long story short, I was asked eventually and applied for and received the headship of the Department of Chemistry. So I integrated what remained of the physics and chemistry sections of the applied science into the physics and chemistry departments, the traditional departments, and that laboratory was allowed to go out of business. And I started in the chemistry department here as head of the department in 1956.
How would you compare administration in an academic setting to in a government lab?
Well, better and worse. You know, the administration, given that same level, relative level of financing, which, you know, even poor administrators are popular in times of prosperity and expanding budgets, and good administrators get in trouble when there's a shrinkage in the budget, especially university structures. I need to elaborate on this with you. You know, there's so much territorial stuff involved in university administration, and so many self-interest groups, and so many prima donnas who find cooperation difficult. Administration in general is much more difficult in a way at a university, especially if there's a shrinking budget. But in the end, the quality of the people is more important than the structural thing. I think over in the university, the structure isn't as important, I don't think, because it's very difficult to judge success because you have no bottom line. What's the bottom line? How do you determine things? Well, quality is such a difficult thing to do. The teaching ability is so difficult to evaluate. building up the infrastructure of a department is long, difficult. Well, this department had not been a research-oriented department at all. As a matter of fact, it had been drifting for many years, the Department of Chemistry. And when I came in 1956, what I wanted to do was try to obviously begin to be competitive with other departments our size and with our potentialities. And I was fortunate because at that time, also, this was after Sputnik, so there was a lot of federal money involved. And if we had people who were aggressive, I felt that we could change the department around. So the first thing to do was to encourage as many people who were here to either seek other positions or to take early retirement, so that even with a small department, there were enough changes involved so that we could bring in some younger people who were much more interested in research, much more aggressive about securing funds. And then administratively, the biggest problem was to gain more independence and more visibility as an independent department. The Department of Chemistry had been almost partially integrated with the Department of Chemical Engineering. It was chemical and metallurgical engineering. And the engineering college was undergraduate education oriented almost completely. They had the so-called co-op plan, and that was their big thing. And there was actually relatively little research going on in engineering, and a small amount more in chemistry. But the two graduate departments were one unit, and so my first goal was to gain independence so that we could move in a direction without all that dragging along all the inertia of the past associations. Well, that was accomplished rather painlessly, and I think we started to move during those years when I was head of the department. And eventually, I think I probably, in the process, probably had to rub too many of the entrenched interests too hard, and I felt after about 6 years that my usefulness as a department head had diminished substantially. So I asked to be relieved of department head responsibilities in 1962. So in 1962, I just became professor of chemistry here in the Department of Chemistry. And a few years later, in thinking of ways in which I could get some more independence for myself in terms of catalysis and do some honoring of the person who had been my predecessor as head of the department, Hogus Green, I thought of this idea of establishing what I called the Hogus Green Laboratory of Catalysis, which really meant the laboratories which I supervised being considered a unit. I recognized, I think, before many other people did, that catalysis could be a separate, important field, that developments in chemistry were such that transition metal catalysis in particular homogeneous transition metal catalysis could be well integrated into a chemistry department, and that could be a special area of a sub-discipline that would require a great deal of attention and had great potentialities. So I think we recognized early on that this area was tremendously important both for understanding fundamental chemistry and in terms of economic utilization, that it was a very good field to get into with interface to industry and academia. And I thought that we'd get support for such research, and that it would be very rewarding in terms of the new area of organometal chemistry. So that's what we've been going on for the last all these years.
And what is the connection between you and Green, who you named the catalysis laboratory.
Yeah. Well, he was, as I say, after he left the department here, became dean of the graduate school, and then he became provost and a vice president for academic affairs in the central administration. So I had to work, in a sense, through him and around him as well. So that also required some special efforts, and I thought that someone else might be able to break that up a little better than myself. But he is still alive, Lucas Green, and he contributes money to this laboratory at the rate of about now, his personal funds, about $3,000 a year, which he gives to the laboratory and allows me to spend at my discretion. And then I get some, over the years, starting in well, even before that, I've been very lucky in getting general fund support for this laboratory. The university has funded me continuously at the level of one postdoctoral fellow plus a secretary for the last 25 years, which is very unusual in a university setup to have continuous funding for a postdoctoral fellow and a secretary from general funds. So I've been, I think, very fortunate in getting that support from the university. So at the present time, I retired officially as a professor of chemistry in 1981. My wife was getting ill. I could see that she was going to be in for a long, debilitating illness. So I retired officially as professor of chemistry in 1981 so that I would have more flexibility with my time. But I retained my title as director of this laboratory, which really isn't much in terms of administrative responsibility, since I only have several postdoctoral fellows working with me and no other responsibilities. So since 1981, I've been professor of chemistry, emeritus, and still continue as director of the Hocus Green Laboratory, which is a non-salary position, but which is still supported by the university to the tune of this postdoctoral fellow and the secretarial assistants. So I'm still active as director, and I had no teaching responsibilities, no committees that I serve on, except for occasional ones of either the department or the administration finds there might be some difficulty in staffing for other sources who ask me to participate. So on these special occasions I will serve on committees. Will I continue to be active, and in this period when my wife started to become ill, my productivity and energies as far as chemistry were concerned were diverted, became much less. She died about 1.5 years ago, and I'm just now starting to get up to a level that I hope will be somewhat higher in the last couple of years.
Well, if we go back to the Bureau of Mines, I first came across your name on a dehydrocyclization review paper. How did that come about?
Mm-hmm. Well, what we were looking at there, the principal collaborator, you may remember, is Leslie Regal. What I was concerned with there was the recognition that the structures that we isolated from coal hydrogenation were much more aromatic, in my opinion, than the original coal substances. In other words, that these weren't primary structures in the coal, that they were derivative structures. And how were they derived? Well, they were derived, I thought, by these dehydrocyclization reactions, in which, well, take a model. One of the early models we have is take something as simple as bitoluene with orthobitoluene. You got diphenyl with 2 methyl groups ortho to each other. Now, if you lose hydrogen from those methyl groups, you'll close that down and get phenanthrene. Now, if you look at it the other, that's when the methyl groups are on the same side. Now, if you do a 180-degree rotation around the single bond there, you put one methyl on one side and one on the other side, and we got a chance now of closing directly into the ring, a methyl into the ring. Well, that also happens. You get a methyl fluorine from that. Well, that started us off on a long series of papers in which we could lose hydrogen and form rings between methyl or methylene hydrogens and between methyl hydrogens and ring hydrogens to get all these polycondensed structures, which are what you find in coal products, but which I don't think are present to any extent in the coal structure. So that was an attempt to model reactions which might be occurring. And of course, I think that's those reactions specifically aren't identified, but the general principle that there is, that the aromatic structures isolated are not reflective of the original structures, I think is pretty well established, and that you have a lot of hydrogen loss and hydrogen shuffling around the coal structure during the conversions and temperatures in the 400 to 450 degree range.
How did you come to get the position at the University of Cincinnati? Did you hear about this, or was one person instrumental?
Yeah, this fellow that I mentioned, Charles Frank, when I decided I would like to get a teaching job, I thought around about people I know who are at universities. Well, Charlie Frank got his PhD at Ohio State University a year before I did. And I had known him as an organic chemist. As a matter of fact, we worked in one of the same laboratories together for a short period. So in just trying to reach out to as many people as I could whom I had personal connections with, I contacted him, and he, fortunately, that inquiry coincided with his prospective leaving the university to go to National Distillers. And of course, I had to have an unusual situation because at that time I was already, I was in not mid-career, but very well-established career already, so that I couldn't compete with incoming people for entry-level professorships, assistant professorships, or instructors. So it just seemed to me, although it was a chancy thing, that such opportunities for me would be rather rare, and I'd rather start somewhere. And so it just turned out that, by coincidence in a way, a set of happy coincidences, that this became available. So here I am back in Cincinnati after starting out my career. Actually, the first job I ever got.
Now, was the University of Cincinnati a private school at that time?
No, it was at that time was completely city-owned and operated. That is, the people, they got their entire budget, operating budget, from the city. And in 1953, well, it was clear that that the city tax base was really shrinking, and that the university would be in trouble. And so there was then a development that the city university became a state-supported university, and then finally in 1975 a full state university. So I witnessed this transformation from city to the state-supported city to full state conversion.
And how did you learn about the position at Houdry, consulting position?
Oh, well, there were several leads there. For one thing, one of my collaborators in the physical chemistry division at the Bureau of Mines was Sal Weller. Sal Weller, that name, he was a physical chemist, very bright guy. We did a little collaborative research at the Bureau of Mines. He left the Bureau of Mines, I think, before I did, and he went to work with Houdry. So I had that connection. And then I knew that in catalytic chemistry that Mills, Oblad, the names were familiar to me, so I just sort of struck out and then made advances to them, and we just hit it off. I became very friendly with Alex, with the two, Alex Oblad and Mills, And I think they're both very unusual people for different reasons. And then Farkas came to Hoodry after I had a consultant there for a few years, and then Burt and I became very close, and we had a great deal of many things in common. I used to see him frequently, both scientifically and socially when I visited Hoodry. We maintained a very close friendship all these years.
Well, now Farkas, in his younger career, was what you would consider a pure academic scientist. How did he come to get into industry, and how did he fit in industry?
Yeah. Well, of course, you really have to talk to Burt about that, so I would just view it as an outsider. He never shared that with me, but I think he worked for a union oil company first. I think it was a matter for him to get a position. You know, his brother, with whom we collaborated, his brother was what, Ladislav, I think Ladislav. They were Hungarian, and they escaped, I think they went to Germany, or were educated in Germany. In any case, they had to leave Europe, and I think they both went to England first. And then from England, his older brother went to Jerusalem, Hebrew University, and became a very distinguished, well, he was then, Farkas and Farkas had done some very nice work with Melville on, you know, that hydrogen exchange stuff that they did together. And I think that Burt went to Israel, or what was Palestine there, and probably didn't get as well acclimated, possibly because his wife might not have been as interested in remaining there as he was. But in any case, it didn't remain. I think he probably could have got placed there, and he tried hard. And so it was a matter of finding a livelihood, I think. And he may have had the same trouble that people in mid-career anywhere would have in trying to get an academic position. You know, there aren't so many academic positions in mid-career, except from transfer from one university to another. It's rather rare. You can probably count the number of cases you know on the fingers of both hands of people who are in industry and transfer in, and they get distinguished by their rarity almost. But it doesn't happen too often. So I think it was a matter of finding a position that involved some kind of catalytic work and you know, a good paying position. So.
Well, having been one of the few who made that transition, do you think U.S. universities are missing out on a lot
Yes.
by not doing this?
Yes, yes. I mean, you know, when I retired here in 1981, obviously the position opened up here, and I was arguing, although not vociferously, for a person like myself, whom I knew was sort of mid-career and had a lot of experience, for such a person to come here. And he got no sympathy at all from my colleagues because they saw it in their terms. And they wanted some young person with exciting chemistry, you know, would bring fame and fortune to the university. And of course, it didn't turn out that way. But unless you have a department head who's very strong and determined to act independently, you'll never get a faculty to agree on, or be rare, let's put it that way, be rare. It's rare that a faculty would agree on this. You know, there are certain cases like that that have happened, but these people are very, very unusual and have unusual qualities. But it does happen, you know. I think you could probably name some people who have had that route, but it's not very easy to do. And it gets more difficult as universities become so-called more democratized, when everything has to be done by votes of everybody else rather than having a strong administrator, because department heads themselves are chosen by votes.
Well, what do you think is the thing that inhibits university faculties from seeing the good chemistry that's done in industry?
Well, I think they still look down somewhat on most industrial research. They think that the quality is not the quality that is appropriate for a university. And of course, in large measure, that's true because people aren't permitted the kinds of freedom and long-term efforts that you can get at a university. But there's no recognition about the individual qualities, and within that framework of constraints, there's plenty of creativity, inventiveness, and brains available. But you know, you base it on what has the person done, and that person in the industry has a lot of difficulty. First of all, doing the work, and second of all, publishing. And that may be recognized and lip service given to it, but nothing beyond that, generally.
Well, if you compare college education when you were an undergraduate at Ohio State and college education today, what are the major differences that you see?
Well, at least the way I teach it, I think that there's probably the science is developed so well that we can integrate it much better, relate one thing to another, find generalizations and principles that are common to subdisciplines and either interdisciplinary disciplines. And I think that the advances have allowed us, our understanding of basic mechanisms now is so much greater that you can relate things, you can predict things, you don't have to memorize so much material, you can figure it out from principles, both in terms of reactions and structures, and of course the new tools too that give you insight into especially structural chemistry, and then separation procedures are so different now. The whole apparatus that we use in my laboratory working days, what would we have in drawers? We would have Erlenmeyer flasks, round bottom flasks, stirrers of all kinds, dropping funnels. I never heard of a syringe. A syringe was a thing that doctors used. Well, you go in the laboratory now and you open up a drawer and you have surely more syringes than flasks of all kinds. And the quantities involved in which you can get materials, distillation, I don't think, I'd be surprised if there weren't many organic chemists who went through their whole careers now never doing a distillation, a real distillation. They may flash something off, but to do a real through a distillation column, it's unusual these days. And so the separation procedures, with thin layer chromatography, following reactions, the techniques are so different. The equipment is so different. The kind of skills now that are required, organic skills, the manipulative skill is important, but it's a different kind of manipulation. The student now, you can tell the difference between students by they'll sit down on an instrument and the kinds of material they can extract from an instrument now compares to what you would be able to do, one chemist doing crystallization or recrystallization and handling small quantities of material, being able to transfer. This is now less important than being able to extract optimum performance out of an instrument to interpret what you get.
Well, one of the things that Herbert Brown was complaining about was that instrumentation and the ready availability by buying things inhibits students from charging ahead and trying to check out an idea with ingenuity and very quickly. Do you see that?
Well, I see some of it. I disagree generally with that. I think that the good aggressive students do the same thing but in a different way. And you get much more information much more readily. You might have to spend 4 days now a clever guy using the instruments can find out what the hell he's doing in a matter of minutes. You run a reaction, run it right around, and gets a spectrum or a mass spec, he gets an infrared spectrum or a mass spectrum, it tells it immediately. But that doesn't inhibit him, that means that just he's able to do that much more. Then I'm talking about the good students responding. I don't think it's inhibiting at all. I think it's a tremendously effective accelerator, or can be, depending again upon the student and his advisor and his, I mean, I've gone over things with students and we've done experiments in a matter of days that would have taken months previously. And then they're available for the next thing. If it doesn't work, we tell right away, is it going or isn't it going? I mean, it's just a whole different ballgame. But I don't see that that's inhibited aggressive, inquiring, able students. Quite the contrary.
Well, you mentioned cross-linking when you were working on polymers. How did you measure cross-linking back then?
Well, we did measure it. We measured by solubility. Yeah, that's about it. You know, we came out of solution, or stability, very crude characterizations of cross-linking. Mostly a question of solubility and swelling.
Now, when you then came up on Dabco, did getting the patent occur to you, or were you encouraged by someone to get the patent on Dabco?
Well, both. I think that I had a sort of push on Alex Mills, and Alex Mills had to push harder on his management because it was a strange new area for them. And I was just enthusiastic, you know. I saw the damn thing, see? I mean, they never heard of polyurethane before at Hoover. They didn't know what the hell a polyurethane was. But here I was, I saw this guy's experiment, you know, dramatic. You mix some liquids, you know, 5, 10 cc's of liquids, and all of a sudden you got this carton of milk filled with this thing. I mean, it's just dramatic as hell. I said, use 1/10 the amount of material on a molar basis, and it did it even better. Just so exciting that I just couldn't contain myself.
Well, now Alex is a good salesman, and so he helped prevail upon.
That's right. Yeah.
And so the patent was then assigned to Houdry. And
yeah. The patent was assigned to Houdry. I got $1 or whatever it takes for the assignment, but that was part of our, you know, our consulting,
your agreement.
Consulting agreement, and I never felt. You know, there was an enormous money maker for them. Oh, I don't know how many millions of dollars it made for them. Yeah, you know, I thought maybe they could have, if they were generous, they could have.
At least hired 2 postdocs for it.
Yeah, but they never really got that kind of support from them or their successor Air Products, which I thought would have been nice to have done, but I feel that, you know, any terms that I had with them they fulfilled anything. There wasn't much, and I fulfilled what I was supposed to do, so I don't feel terrible, a little disappointed, but not really annoyed, I would say. And of course, I led to some very wonderful friendships with Alex Mills and Burt Davis and Alex Oakland. I liked them as individuals enormously. I've had very nice relationships with those 3 fellows. And Heinz Heinemann was at Houdry, then Saul Weller, so they had quite a nice, it was, you know, I like those kind of consultantships when I learned more than they learned from me.
Well, I was at Air Products 3 or 4 years ago and ran into an individual that was still wearing a necktie with Dabco symbols on it.
Yeah, I have one of those now.
So you at least got one of the Dabco neckties.
Yeah, I have one of the Dabco neckties, yeah.
What do you think caused the Houdry Labs to be so successful and produce so much good industrial research and academic research during the period that you were consulting there?
Well, I think it was the leadership from Oblad and Mills to recognize the importance of fundamental chemistry. I think they were really, I would say, pioneers, but they had a real fundamental understanding of the value of fundamentals. And although I think Soblat was tended to talk more about it than implementing it, he really had a good philosophy about it. And of course, they always had to justify these things to management. And their early success, allowed them the little bit of freedom. It's nothing like a little success to get the people off your back for a while, huh? If it turns up in the annual report or the quarterly report, the financial statement looks pretty favorable, it's easier to carry on the research work. So I think it was a matter more, of course, even starting with Eugene Houdry himself, but I think it was a matter of the leadership, the technical leadership, and they apparently had enough management clout to allow them to get funded properly.
Did you get to meet Houdry?
I met Eugene Houdry once at his home in Swarthmore, and he obviously was an unusual person, but our contact was very marginal and peripheral mostly. I just had one meeting with him at his home, but he was obviously an impressive person.
How did you get involved to write the book on molecular orbital theory so soon after
yes.
This was announced?
That's another story. That now comes to to some of the work that I've done over the years outside of organometal chemistry. When I came to the Department of Chemistry, I started to interact with Hans Jaffe, who's a physical chemist, theoretician, for a variety of reasons, some administrative and some technical. And I had written a book with Gus Friedel at the Bureau of Mines on the ultraviolet spectra of aromatic compounds. Gus Friedel and I had written that book. And in putting that together and thinking about ultraviolet spectra, I realized that practically all of my knowledge was empirical, that I could relate one thing to another, but I didn't know the basis for why these things were what they were. Now, when you look at a spectrum, say an ultraviolet spectrum, infrared spectrum, you plot one thing, what you plot against what is some energy form, which is wavelength or wave number or frequency, against intensity or some measure of intensity. Well, the place on the ordinate, the energy scale, in the case of ultraviolet spectra, which I had worked on, was a question of promotion of electrons from high occupied orbitals to low unoccupied orbitals. Well, that means you have to know something about the energies of these orbitals. You have to know where they lie on an energy scale and what that gap is between them and why. Well, that requires obviously a knowledge of molecular orbital theory. But then if we look at the other coordinate, which is an intensity measurement, that's related mostly to selection rules. And that selection rules are mostly based on symmetry considerations. So it seemed to me what I needed to understand was something about molecular orbitals and something about symmetry and selection rules. And so I started to talk to Jaffe. I would annoy him constantly with questions, dumb questions. And he would gradually answer me back. And then I finally realized that the reason I had to ask him so damn many questions was that I couldn't find it anywhere in the literature. So eventually I said, Hans, we ought to write something on this. I'm beginning to understand this stuff here. I think I'm beginning to understand how you construct molecular orbitals, what their meaning is, and how you calculate their energies. And that's fundamental for real understanding of all ultraviolet spectra of all kinds of electronic transitions depend on that, from the simple to the most complex. And then on the other hand, this symmetry, I can see that how important that is. We have a pi to sigma star transition or pi to pi star, we know that one is very allowed and one isn't allowed, and it hinges on the symmetry of the transition. And the same thing applies to ultraviolet spectra. Infrared spectra. We know some transition, when we have a center of symmetry, we don't have any band corresponding to a stretch that still involves the center of symmetry. We really ought to get together. So I talked him into doing a book on theory and applications of ultraviolet spectra. If you look at that book, the fundamentals are laid out in the early part, and it was a matter of him educating me, and then me being able to put this in a language that an organic chemist, as against a theoretician, would understand. So it had to be essentially non-mathematical and more operational. That is, when we do a symmetry transformation, I would be able to describe it in words, and he would give me the mathematical basis for it. So I'd like to say that he made it right, and I made it understandable. So it was a good collaboration. So when we did our first book, which is a very successful book, Theory and Applications of Ultraviolet Spectroscopy, I heard once Porter give a lecture at the Weizmann Institute. I happened to be in Israel then, and Porter was an invited guest, and he talked about the Bible of organic spectroscopy, and he mentioned that book. I thought that was pretty good. He hadn't got the Nobel Prize yet at that time, but it was a very well accepted book. And then I looked at that and I said, you know what we ought to do is to isolate out of this the symmetry part, because the symmetry has much more pervasive importance than just in ultraviolet spectroscopy. It's got infrared spectroscopy, it's got some dipole moments, anything you can think of involves some kind of symmetry. The number of isomers, reactivity, everything sort of depends on symmetry. Why don't we write a book called Symmetry in Chemistry? Well, we started to write this book and had it fairly well completed when Cotton came out with his book on what's he call his book? Cotton's book, Group Theory, Applications of Group Theory. Well, group theory depends on symmetry considerations. So we changed our thing a little bit to not be directly be competitive with his book. We felt that ours was much more readable. And so we came out with this book, Symmetry in Chemistry, which again was all absolutely correct from a theory point of view, and the mathematics were all that Jaffe assured. Jaffe's participation assured us of that. And then I saw all the applications and how to explain that to people who don't have a strong mathematical background. So it's a readable kind of thing. Then I saw in there that what people never worried about, organic chemists never even thought about anti-bonding orbitals. What the hell are those? Why should anybody? They're not active. Who gives a damn? Well, they're important because they got to accept things. The basis of the orbital conservation, all the Woodward-Hoffman rules depend on unoccupied orbitals, which are usually anti-bonding. So we have a little book called The Importance of Anti-Bonding Orbitals, which would appeal to undergraduates, pointing out that, listen, it really is important to understand those unoccupied orbitals, because sometimes they get occupied. Particularly in our organometal work, you see, because all that back bonding stuff, when you have a ligand that comes in, it's already saturated. Now, when you get some donation from the metal back into the ligand, you got to use these higher orbitals. And their symmetry and energies then are very important. If you coordinate carbon monoxide, you have to occupy, in the back coordination, you have to occupy the lowest empty orbitals and their anti-bonding orbitals. So this energy and their symmetry is very important. It determines the strength of the bond between the metal and the carbon, in part. So we have this little book called The Importance of Anti-Bonding Orbitals. And then it occurred to me that, gee, now we got all these things. We understand symmetry, orbitals, and spectra. This would be a good integrating course in the first quarter of graduate study. You can get all graduate students into this field here and understanding it's good for physical chemistry, it's good for inorganic chemistry, it's good for organic chemistry. This is something that transcends and integrates all these subdisciplines of chemistry. So we wrote a book called Symmetry, Orbitals, and Spectra, which was designed for a first-year quarter course in graduate chemistry. And I taught that here for 5 years or so, and I thought the students loved it. I mean, they understood what the hell was going on. I gave a course out at Berkeley on this subject in the summer. I had 30 people in this course, and one of the people in this course was a postdoctoral working with Andy Strykeweezer. And he had been making these ab initio calculations and molecular orbital calculations for a few years. And he sat in this course, he says, geez, I've been making all these calculations, I'm real good at it. He said, but this is the first time I really understood what the hell I was doing. So I felt very good about that, and I think our book does that. But it's not even accepted here as a text anymore. After I finished teaching it, it's sort of, and when in my absence, they voted to put it in the second quarter instead of the first quarter as a required course, and it wasn't doing the thing that I designed it for. But that's.
What, does it get easier to write books after the first one?
I would say that. Might even get harder because you're more demanding, you know. Well, Jeffy and I had a very good relationship. He was tough, and he was tough about making it correct, and I was tough about making it understandable. That the equation, mathematical equation, may mean a lot to people who have the background to understand it, to an ordinary organic chemist looking at the equation, unless you really finish with the equation rather than start with it. People may have understanding of the significance of it. I'm more interested in the significance rather than the calculation of it. What's it mean? How can you put this together rather than doing the calculations?
Well, one of the people that you worked closely with was Bob Anderson, and I'm not going to get to sit down informally like this with him. How would you describe Bob Anderson?
I actually didn't work with him practically at all.
So you didn't get to know him very well?
Not very well.
Bureau Mines?
No. He was in the other group, physical chemistry group, working on, surface reactions and surface properties and surface areas and how to modify things. So actually, I didn't have much interaction with him at all. Very little. We don't have any paper in common. I don't think I've ever had a problem in which I saw that we would have a mutual interest in, that we could be mutually helpful to each other in. So I didn't have any collaboration with Bob at all.
Who would you say was the most creative person that you've worked with?
Well, intellectually, I would say Jaffe was. Jaffe, he saw relationships, and he was the most original person. One of the most organized, knowledgeable persons was Burt Davis. That is, Burt I sort of used as a test that if I could get past him with something, I felt that I was home. He was very critical, insightful, and you can't make a mistake without his picking up on it. But that's a different kind of thing. With Jaffe, I thought, was the most original mind. Of course, it's skillful. At that time, of course, time's passed, and your relationship, say my relationship with Newman, he was sort of mentor and student. So it wasn't as it frequently is today. Now, with some of my students, I feel, at least I feel from my point of view, that we're on an equal, we're talking as equals. I never had that feeling talking with Mal. He was really demigod.
But do you think your students feel the same way that you did toward you?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Most of my students, I think, feel warmly toward me. I like working with the students, and I think I try to bring out their abilities. I'm not as good at that as some of the other people in the department here. One particular person in the department here, Marshall Wilson, who I think is able to do that much more successfully than I ever have. I'm not quite sure what it is he has that I don't, but I can see I can see as the student grows and matures in his group, I can see his impact. I'm not sure scientifically that I think that in terms of approach and attitudes and philosophy, I think I impart that. But there's nothing really scientifically that would stamp a student of mine as a student of mine.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, with Marshall Wilson, I can identify the students, the way they write structures, the way they look at problems. I see his influence scientifically, to a lesser extent Jaffe, but Wilson I think is particularly good at that. He really influences the scientific thought of his students. I didn't feel that that they don't get that much. I can't get a stamp of what in terms of the scientific. I do think I do it attitudinal, how you approach problems, how you analyze them, you sit back and look at them, how you choose a problem, how much time you spend on it, all those kinds of things. I think I feel that I've been, because I have a range of students who have been very successful, most of them industrial, most of them have managerial positions, and I kind of flatter myself into believing that perhaps I had a little influence on helping them see what's important. What do you choose to do with your time? How do you want to spend your time? What should you do rather than do that? How do you make a choice between these things that you want to do? What's needed to be known after you do it, assuming you're successful? What do you know after you've succeeded? How much farther along are you in understanding what it is I think those kinds of things are sort of gradually imparted to students over the 3 or 4 years of talking together, and a certain enthusiasm and well, mostly attitudinal, that this is, such an exciting thing to be engaged in. There's everything is more complex than you think. You think you understand it, that's too bad, because you really don't. You better get back down. Let's say I'll give you some problem. Do you really know what happens? And you find out, as usual, as I do, that I don't understand very much.
Well, one person in catalysis that really put his stamp on his students was Hugh Taylor. Did you get to know him?
No, I never think so. I think of the names people think catalysis in heterogeneous, Burwell probably knows most anybody. He's an unusual person in many respects. It's had a lot of influence, development in catalysis.
Well, Ostwald would describe scientists either as a classicist who pursued something in great depths, or a romantic who would hit something hard and then move on. How would you see yourself in that classification?
Well, probably in that, as in other things, as halfway, I have sort of a, although you see, if you looked at I just got my publications together on just, say, carbonyl chemistry. And I think I have 80 some publications dealing with the chemistry one way or another of carbonyls. So you would think that, I've stuck pretty good. But both intellectually and I think scientifically, as well as in my life, I have sort of a romantic kind of, I like this, do some fantasizing about the importance of things, and I have a lifelong romance with chemistry.
Well, one thing we haven't covered very extensively is your work with cobalt carbonyl and your work on hydroformylation.
Yeah.
How did you come to set this up at the University of Cincinnati?
again, partly because it was practical in terms of the kind of things I was trying to do. I needed to have an area which had some industrial interface. Not only because I was oriented myself that way, but also because of the demands of support. And I wanted to go to industrial support. And I felt that the hydroformylation reaction had enough industrial significance to get support for fundamental work in it. Furthermore, it involved equipment which is not standard in universities, the high-pressure equipment using high-pressure carbon monoxide reactions, high-pressure hydrogen reaction combinations thereof, is not standard stuff in most universities, so it would give me some positioning that was unusual. And then the chemistry is fascinating to me, and it's a complex reaction. We know it's homogeneous. So all the elements were there. It was a bridge between heterogeneous, which I don't know very much about, and homogeneous, which allows me to study things in solution, which I have a better chance of understanding. It used techniques which were unusual to universities that I had some experience with, and it's as much theoretical as you would care to make it. That is, the bonding between metal sites and ligands. It involves molecular theory, ligand field theory, spectroscopy, modes of determining the extent of interaction, symmetry considerations. It just is it's a hanger on which I can put all kinds of things onto it. So it was a very good central focus intellectually, practically, in terms of external support, in terms of getting recognition in the field. That is importance for a variety of things. It allows you to do as much or little as you wish to do theoretically. So it's a very rewarding to me kind of focus. That and the platinum chemistry, which I started here. Platinum chemistry I started again because I knew that platinum was used in refining operations. I also knew that people knew very little bit. It wasn't like the question of acid catalyzed reactions. Metal catalyzed reactions, like the platinum reaction that might be epitomized in the platforming thing. It had to involve some interaction between the platinum and the metal. So I very early got interested in olefin platinum complexes. And we have dozens of articles on platinum olefin complexes, which are in part expressed in the Wacker reaction, which is really the conversion of ethylene to acetaldehyde. We did some very early work on the Wacker, so-called Wacker reaction, which I didn't discover, but which the elements of which I had laid out before Wacker discovered it. And what I didn't realize was that I couldn't reoxidize the platinum, whereas palladium does reoxidize. And I was stuck with platinum, so I got a lot of the theoretical stuff, the basic chemistry, but not any of the exploitation of that reaction, mostly because I didn't have a system for reoxidizing the platinum. Once the platinum goes to platinum zero, you're finished. You can't do anything with that. Station potential is such you can't. But I didn't realize that.
Well, what was it that led you to realize that cobalt was present as a monomer in the carbonyl?
Oh, well, we had done that early work at the Bureau of Mines with Irv Wender, and I'd gotten a good feel for that early work. But one of the first things we did here was to actually isolate the hydrido-cobalt in the reaction mixture, which had never been done before. And that was done, I think, in a very dramatic way with the student. And what we did simply was that I had a feeling that the hydrido-cobalt was in that solution under reaction conditions, but that in normal workups it was always converted back to the dicobalt carbonyl. So the idea was to freeze it, and that's exactly what we did. After the high pressure, high temperature reaction, we left the pressure on and reduced the temperature very quickly by socking the whole autoclave in a dry ice bath and get this wad of ice around that and chopped open the ice and then released the pressure at -70, and then when we searched for the hydrocarbon, we found it. So we knew it was being formed. We had known, we had had an article from the Bureau of Mines in which we showed that the hydrocobalt could act as a stoichiometric reagent for hydroformylation. It could. The question is, was it present? And to what extent was it present? And we did that quantitatively. We determined that the bulk of the cobalt under reaction conditions, by freezing that out and analyzing for the hydrocobalt, we had worked out methods for analyzing hydrocobalt and dicobalt, the Bureau of Mines. So we could do that quantitatively, and we showed then that the hydrocobalt was present under hydroformylation conditions. So then that convinced me to spend most of my time on working with hydrocobalt as a stoichiometric reagent, because I knew it was present as a catalyst. So then all the reactions that I could show with hydrocobalt as a stoichiometric reaction could be duplicated in the autoclave. And then we worked out very simple ways of making hydrocobalt and keeping it, storing it, using it. And most of these publications are stoichiometric reagent.
Was there some area that I have neglected to bring up or that you recall that we should cover?
Well, I think in a series of articles, we've touched base a little bit on the selenium, which was quite interesting. It's funny what people pick up, but for example, in Fieser's book, about the only thing that he cites me on is on selenium work. Now, the reason I got interested in selenium, I had an old interest in selenium because in the early characterization of hydroaromatics, one of the things to do is to aromatize. And there are a variety of ways you can aromatize hydroaromatics. One of the ways is by heating it up with selenium. And what you get is the selenium hydride out, and you get the aromatic compound. So this reaction of what the hell was going on with selenium, it was thought that you needed it in stoichiometric quantities because it was a stoichiometric reaction, you eliminated it. But when I started to do this work with Fitzpatrick, he told me that in the art, selenium was used, bulk selenium was used to isomerize cis to trans fatty acids, oleic to its isomer oleic acid, that you got the equilibrium mixture using selenium. I said, Jesus, how much selenium do you have to use? He says, well, people throw in a lot. So I said, I wonder if it's catalytic. I didn't say that, but I found out a different way. And the way I found out was very interesting. It was part of our relationship between Fitzpatrick and me, which is so critical always, I think, in working with people you're working with. Fitzpatrick and I decided we'd like to work on oleic acid. So the first thing you do is have to get pure oleic acid. Well, you can buy it, but oh, it's extraordinarily expensive. So he says, why buy it? He says, I'll take it out of olive oil. He says, I'll isolate it from olive oil. So he showed me how to isolate it from olive oil. And he had pure oleic acid. So then I said, okay, now we need some of the pure isomer, the oleic acid. So I said, you can't buy that even, you have to make it. So I said, well, I'll do the isomerization the way it's in the literature. I'll isomerize it to the equilibrium mixture of cis and trans, and I know the techniques for separating those two. You make lead salts of the acids, and then there's the solubility thing. And so he did all this, and he got his pure oleic acid, which melts at about 40. Oleic acid melts about -5 or 5, somewhere low temperature. So he had this beautiful looking crystalline oleic acid. So I said, I'll tell you, Fitz, I says, I just have a bias I learned from Newman that you should, for final purification, you should distill the thing. He says, what do you mean distill? He says, it's pure, for Christ's sake. Why should I distill it? It's got a very sharp. I says, well, I got no good reason. I says, just do me a favor, distill it, will you? So he puts it in a flask, And I'm curious, I want to know whether he's really going to distill it, see. So I go in, we had to build some, because it's a very high boiling point, see, so we had to build a molecular still, which didn't please him very much. So he got this molecular still operating, distills this beautiful lady gas, and it comes over, and he's got it in ice. So, well, it should crystallize right away. No, so he finds it's liquid. So he turns to me angry and says, God damn it, he says, I had this fucking thing pure, and now I isomerized the damn thing here. Back to the mixture, it won't freeze. So I says, Fitz, I says, Jesus, I says, that's exciting as hell. I said, here you thought you had this pure, there's something in there that's isomerized, and the only thing that could isomerize must be a trace of selenium. I says, that selenium is catalytic. It isn't stoichiometric or, it's catalytic. That's the only thing you've got in there. So, well, he didn't buy it. Well, anyway, to make a long story short, we did find it was, in fact, catalytic, the selenium. And then the question is, what's the mechanism of the catalysis? Well, I thought it ought to be very close to oxygen. That's right. So that is, we get S2. Because how the hell do you get S2, Se2? I said, he says if you want to postulate that you get the hydroselenide, like you get a hydroperoxide at the allylic position. So I says, well, we got to get some pure selenium. So we got some ultra-pure selenium, and he tries this reaction, the isomerization, and it's dead. It doesn't work at all. So it turns out that there are a lot of forms of selenium, and this particular super-duper pure was a crystalline selenium, which couldn't depolymerize to give us the Se2 species. So when he converted, we learned how to convert this crystalline to the other form of selenium, and then using the same selenium and an argon, so there was no oxygen or anything, then he found that this converted form, which was a ring structure with Se2,6 or something, I've forgotten the detail, but in any case, we had to convert this super pure crystalline form to another modification, which was the active modification of this. So it was a very interesting story. We got quite a few publications out of that in a long time, a lifelong friendship out of it. And then I used this idea to go back then to the dehydrogenations of these hydroaromatic things. And one of the things we used was a natural product to show, I think it was glycol, we used that to show that you could dehydrogenate that to the aromatic thing. But the mechanism of that dehydrogenation was a disproportionation, because we didn't get the hydrogen selenide out. So the hydrogen was being transferred. The selenium was a hydrogen transfer agent. We formed the H2SE, and then it was used to hydrogenate some more. So we got disproportionated stuff out. We got the aromatic stuff and the more hydrogenated stuff than what we started with. So that was kind of a little interesting story. It's one of the areas that we fussed around with. I think that's most of the major areas. The book writing that did with Jaffe, the whole work on the mechanism of hydroformylation, all the work with hydridocobalt. We've gotten into hydridomanganese recently, and let me just see that. So I think we've covered that. I think one of the most exciting things that's happened in the last 10 years has been the finding radicals in the hydroformylation or model of the hydroformylation reaction. That was with one of my most productive students, Ted Nalesnik, who I think might have been the last student that I saw through with a degree. I think he was my last student, Ted Nalesnik. A marvelous, a diamond in the rough. He got his undergraduate education at Western Kentucky University. And he was the first one in his family to ever go to college. And he was really, once I went out with him, we had lobster. He didn't know what lobster was. When he was just, and his language, was not polished, but he was a tremendous chemist. He just was just great. Well, anyway, we did a lot of work with the hydroformylation reaction, and he did a reaction with diphenylethylene and hydrocobalt in which he observed this Sidnip effect. The Sidnip effect is unassailable evidence for intermediacy of a radical, and what it's manifest in the NMR spectrum by emission rather than absorption. And when he found this system, of course we were obviously looking for it, but we didn't know the conditions which we would find. Anyway, he worked out the conditions, and when he first saw this, he was so enthusiastic and uncontrollable. I mean, he didn't need any inflation. He just went right up in the air automatically. That was the first time that radicals were positively identified in a hydroformylation system. So that was one of the most exciting things, I think, that happened. And now, of course, the classic kind of thing that is now associated when you can make radicals. You'll make radicals in the hydroformylation reaction.
Were you able to pick any one thing in your career that you would say is the most satisfying bit of research you've done?
Well, that was in many ways because we were sort of looking for it, didn't know how to find it, and then the prediction based on that of how certain other substrates would work, and then having him run through the reaction and find that that's the way. For example, inverse isotope effect, which is observed in these reactions. I predicted that a certain olefin, the bifluoronilidine, because it was almost radical in the ground state, that chances of that having an inverse isotope effect would be minimal. And it turned out that of all the compounds that we tried, this was the one that didn't have the inverse, had normal isotope effect, small normal isotope. So it was very satisfying that I can remember that. And I think that experiment, which we found the hydrocobalt tetracarbonyl, and that dramatic, physically dramatic, ice, that big lump of ice, and we had to chop open. I think the biggest kicks are when you look at a reaction in detail and said, if all this is true, then if we do this, we should expect that, and then having it happen, that's exciting.
What do you think, having spent some time in an orphan's home, caused you to develop more slowly, or caused you to have social problems, etc.? Not
either one of those. It made me perhaps more dedicated to achievement, more goal-oriented perhaps, more striving possibly than I might have been otherwise. But and in terms of development, I probably lacked some of the cultural things that the type of family I would have grown up in might have had middle-class cultural exposure, which it did get too much of. Some, but not too much in the orphan home. But all in all, that was a very positive experience. I made some lifelong friendships, and I suppose I learned how to cope a lot better in certain situations. And I think I had just I would say, an unbelievably wonderful marriage, 45 years, and I think in part it was probably that all the needs that I never felt satisfied in there were satisfied in the marriage. It was just an unbelievably beautiful marriage that I had, which probably was helped in part by my experiences. But on the whole, it was quite a positive experience. Matter of fact, I gave a talk in the psychiatry department, which was entitled "In Defense of Orphanages." as against other ways of coping with parent loss, which are now practically all either adoption or foster homes. But a good orphan home served its purpose, and that was a good orphan home by any standards of the day. Yeah, of course, there were plenty of problems, as you can imagine, living with 200 kids and finding your way around. But on the whole, and I say it might have made me, I think that it probably helped in terms of desire to achieve and techniques for seeking ways of fulfillment.
But if you were so successful in business, what was it that kept the financial rewards from causing you to continue in that direction when you were managing a pawn shop at 17?
I hated that. I hated that. Especially that, but maybe that was a good experience in the sense that, that these were during Depression days. People were desperate, and the whole concept of the pawn shop is, that you borrow money or you sell things way below their value. And that distressed me. And you always saw people in need. And that was distressing to me, so I was anxious to leave that. But I got good at it. What I got good at was in evaluating things. That is, any kind of merchandise, I knew how to assess its value I got good at that very quickly, which is the major thing, so you don't get fooled. Someone brings in a diamond and they want $400, and you got to make a decision now. Is this, what are you gonna? What's this thing? What's its true value?
And you don't have time to go around the corner to the jewelry store.
That's right. No, you are the jewelry store, or a watch, or any damn thing, a painting, or a gun, or whatever the hell, for a typewriter, whatever the hell is brought in. You have to make a quick assessment of what the hell it was worth.
Well, was there something tied with your scholarship money that led you to Ohio State, or did you pick that?
No, it was just the cost. My scholarship was $200 a year, and I didn't want to work at college. So I made that $200 pay the tuition and all my living expenses. So I lived very frugally at college because I didn't want to work. But the tuition, say at Ohio State there at that time was $60 for the year. So I had the $140 to live on for a year, which I managed to do. In the summertime, I went back to the orphan home and was a worker. I didn't have any place to live, so I lived there and got my room and board there in exchange for being a worker, playing with the kids and helping around to see that they didn't get in mischief, league games and stuff like that.
Well, at this time, Ohio State is very competitive and limits admissions. Was it that type of a school then, or was it pretty much open?
Well, it didn't bother me anyway. My high school record was very good. While I was in an orphan home, I had the most traumatic experience I think I had was we were in a ghetto neighborhood for 9 of the years. 9 of my 10 years there, we were in a decaying ghetto neighborhood. Then in the 10th year, when I became a senior in high school, we moved out to a completely new setting in Cleveland, in a wealthy, not upper class, upper class. And here I was, I'd been competing with a few other kids from the orphan home, but mostly with blacks in that area who were. So the competition went from having black cohorts there to these upper middle class who, as far as I was concerned, they were part of the movies or something. I didn't know what the hell was going on there. I didn't go in the senior year. I was thrown in with these people. I didn't understand their lifestyles. They were so much better educated than I, but I managed to eventually get on that honor roll and graduated with honors from high school. But that was a traumatic change for me at high school level to get into that, such a changed environment and have to adapt so quickly.
What was it you think permitted you to adapt that quickly? Most people take a little longer than you.
Well, just necessity, you know, the inner necessity and the outer necessity, you know. After all, I'd been a good student in one place, I needed to be a good student in another. It took a little higher work.
Well, while you were in the orphanage, who was the model that gave you this discipline model, or was there one?
No, there wasn't one in terms of achievement. It was just an inner drive, I think. But there was one of the workers there was a very saintly, accepting, understanding kind of person. Although I didn't have a great deal of contact with him, the other kids did, and there was a feeling, there was a surrogate father kind of feeling with him. And in some ways he was a model for intellectuality. He was a model. He was I thought, a brilliant guy, well-read and experienced, and I could talk with him about anything. Especially when I came back there to work in the summers, when I was going to college, then I appreciated even more his unusual intellectual capacities. So he was very stimulating to me in terms of understanding the world and understanding myself.
Were you the oldest child?
No, I was the youngest of four.
You were the youngest?
Yeah.
Then
I had two older sisters, and the oldest one is my brother, who's older than the oldest one in the family. That's it, huh?